And yeah, with that, well, Bob, I think in the Agile world, you don't need an introduction. However, maybe could we start with the question that you tell us a little bit about you, particularly before the manifesto was signed or written or invented?
Oh, well, okay. So my pre-agile life. I've been a programmer for over 50 years. I don't know how many. I was 12 when I wrote my first line of code, and now I'm 68. So that's what, 56 years? Is that right? I think I did that math right. I was a programmer in assembly language in my early years, in C later on, in C++ even later. I became a consultant in 1993 timeframe and have been independent ever since then. Early days, I was consulting in object-oriented design and C++. I would travel all around and yell at people and tell them they were doing their C++ wrong and doing their objects wrong. And of course, that was a very successful kind of business to have. And then I got involved right around 1999. I got involved with Kent Beck with extreme programming. There was something about Kent Beck's work on extreme programming that I really liked. And he and I and Martin Fowler and Ron Jeffries got together and we started teaching classes on extreme programming. And that was very successful. We taught a lot of people. It was right during the dot-com bubble, the economic bubble over the internet. And lots of people came to these courses and we taught them for several years. And then 9/11 occurred and the entire IT industry shut down pretty much for a year or so or more. And right just at about that moment, the Agile Manifesto came about just before 9/11. So that's my pre-Agile days.
So I understand, like, one of the practices that are now known as the Agile practices that you used before was extreme programming.
Yes.
Anything else? So I don't know what the test-driven development, Scrum.
So the early days of Agile really started around 1995, and what was happening in the programming community at the time was design patterns. Design patterns were the big deal. And in the midst of the design patterns movement, the Scrum methodology started to show up. So the very first paper on Scrum actually showed up at a patterns conference in downstate Illinois. And that was Ken Schwaber and Martin DeVoe and a number of other of the Scrummers in those days. And it didn't quite get everybody's attention, but there was this kind of overall nodding saying, yeah, we really need to do something about waterfall because waterfall is a bad idea. And the Scrum thing sounds okay, but, and then along comes extreme programming. By 1999, Kent Beck has dropped that on the world. And at that point, everybody was ready to accept that. Extreme programming was a group of about 12 practices, and those practices involved Scrum. If you look at Scrum has the practices of extreme programming, but extreme programming has more. And in particular, extreme programming has the engineering practices that Scrum lacks. Things like test-driven development and pair programming and simple design and continuous integration. These were ideas that were not part of Scrum in the early days. Scrum has since adopted them, for the most part, to one degree or another. Scrum has adopted most of the engineering practices of extreme programming.
That's interesting, I guess, to know. Like we have lots of people in our audience that are experts in several of these practices, but also some that are very new to that. So it's very interesting to hear that. Let's get to the event. Like, do you remember how was the event organized and by whom?
Well, so Kent Beck and Martin Fowler and I and Ron Jeffries and a bunch of other people had been teaching extreme programming. And this was through 1999 and 2000 and into 2001. And Kent Beck called a meeting. And in that meeting, he called it the Extreme Leadership Meeting. And in that meeting, which we held in Oregon, the idea of forming an organization was mentioned. And the folks in that meeting didn't want to do that. They had already formed an organization over design patterns, and they didn't want to do it again. And that frustrated me because I thought an organization would be a good idea. And apparently so did Martin Fowler, because he approached me later and said, we need to talk. So Martin Fowler and I got together in Chicago a few weeks later, and we composed an email and an invitation list. And we sent this email out to a whole bunch of people. I don't know how many, but it was a lot of people, inviting them to the Lightweight Process Summit. And within hours, Alistair Coburn phoned me and said, I was just about to send the same email, but I like your invitation better than mine. Can I add my people to yours? And in return, I will do all the legwork and we'll have it in Snowbird, Utah. And when someone offers to do something for free, you say yes. So we changed the venue to Snowbird, Utah, and Alistair and Jim Highsmith set the whole thing up. And we all met, 17 of us, on our own money. You know, we flew there on our own money, and we took our own time. And we all met at Snowbird, Utah. I started the meeting by saying, hey, I think we need a manifesto. I sat down, and that was my last contribution. From there on, it was all everybody else doing everything.
Great. So you came up with the manifesto idea.
The word manifesto had stuck in my mind because a number of other people had used it in the software industry, primarily the people who wrote the object-oriented database manifesto. And that word just kind of stuck in my mind. So I thought, we need a manifesto. Maybe it wasn't the best word to use, but apparently it worked.
It worked out well. Well, did you once you met there, I think it was 2 days, if I'm not mistaken.
It was 2 days, yeah, 2 days.
When you met there in Snowbird, did you have the feeling that this will become something special, or was it just another conference get together with people?
Yeah, just another conference get together. There's always the hope. You know, I've been to several of these kind of, you know, meetings that will change the world. I've been to many of these, and they never change the world. It's always just a bunch of guys who write a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard and then they go home. So I thought it was going to be that. Everybody kind of thought it was that. We did have some hope that maybe we could influence some folks. I think the big change was Ward Cunningham at the very end of the meeting said that he was going to take the manifesto as we had written it and put it on a website and allow people to sign it. So the internet was still kind of new, right? This was 2001. And, you know, the idea that people could actually sign a website, that was kind of a new idea, relatively new. And so we all went home and thought, well, you know, nothing's really going to happen. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. We could not advertise this out on a big social network. And lo and behold, tens of thousands of people signed the doggone thing. we didn't know.
So, apparently it did change the world. So now Agile is all over the place.
Yes.
So what do you think, like, how important is the manifesto today?
I think the manifesto is more important now than it was then. And the reason for that is that many of the folks doing Agile have left the basic values of the manifesto and gone off to invent other things. And that's something that concerns me. There is a tendency for people to want to add to the manifesto, or there is another tendency that people want the modern version of the manifesto. And I don't think that's a good idea. these ideas are true in and of themselves, and they don't need a lot of modification or modernization. So I worry that we are getting away from the basic values of the manifesto, and that's probably not a good thing.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that. So, would you actually change something today, or do you think it's all like perfectly fine as it is?
I would not change anything. I think the manifesto was a moment in time. The values were stated. I think the values are good values. I don't think there's a reason to modify it at all. So yeah, I would just leave it alone. Let it stand as it is, as a historical mark. Is there anything happening in the software community that would change the reason for those values? And the answer is no, there isn't anything. Those values are as valid today as they were then. And frankly, they were valid years before that. We just didn't know.
So that's actually great to hear. And let's talk a little bit more about the values and about what we observe here today. I don't know if you observe similar things. So there are obviously interpretations of those values. So something that we have seen, well, let's take the first value. It says people's and interactions over processes and tools. Right? So some things that we sometimes see or hear is an interpretation like, okay, so there's no value in the use of tools, or well, we probably should stop using tools, or processes are useless, or something like that, like an extreme version of that. So have you seen something like that? And what do you think about that?
So it happens frequently that people will look at the manifesto and they will see the values on the left and believe that they completely supersede the values on the right, which, by the way, the manifesto says the exact opposite. Manifesto says that, although we value these things on the right, we value the things on the left more. Processes and tools are valuable. They've always been valuable. It's difficult to get anything done without good processes and tools. But we do value, people more than process. So it's not that we don't value tools. Now look at what's happening today, right? You and I are in the midst of using a tool, Zoom. And it's a good tool. We're really happy we've got this tool in the midst of this COVID pandemic. So I'm very happy that you and I and everybody listening are able to communicate in this fashion using this wonderful tool in order to communicate interpersonal stuff. Now, that's the good side. The bad side, we're in the midst of a pandemic, and the use of the tool has superseded the ability of people to get together. That is not a good thing. We live with it because we're in a pandemic, and so we say, all right, for the time being, we can meet this way. But it would not be good to continue this once the pandemic is over. People need to get together. People need to look each other in the eye. They need to smell each other.
Great. And thanks a lot to clarify that. I think that helps a lot of our attendees. Have you seen other famous misinterpretations, or what have you seen out there? People misinterpreting the Agile Manifesto?
Well, there are two really big misuses of the Agile Manifesto. One of them is to say that Agile is just like waterfall, except done in short steps. And so they try to do a waterfall process every 2 weeks or a waterfall process every month. And that's just a misuse, right? We do not want a waterfall process done at all. We do want the activities of analysis and design and implementation performed in every sprint, but we do not want them ordered within the sprint. The sprint does not begin with an analysis phase and then a design phase and then an implementation phase. All of those activities happen simultaneously and concurrently throughout every sprint. So I see that from time to time, and that's usually motivated by middle managers who don't want to give up on all the process that they've developed over the years. They just want to kind of cram that process into a shorter time frame, and that's not a good idea. The other thing that I see very frequently is the idea that agile should be done in the large. We need a larger framework to hold agile so that teams of thousands of programmers can be agile. This is used by many consulting organizations in order to sell their coaching services. And I don't blame them for doing that. It's fine. Every consulting agency has got to find some way to differentiate their services so that they can sell. On the other hand, agile was never intended to be something in the large. Agile was about getting small teams to write small software in a relatively small amount of time, right? Little projects. That's what agile was about. How do you do big projects in agile? Well, you get a bunch of little teams doing little things and you add them all up and that makes a big team. How do you coordinate those little teams? By using the standard operations research stuff that we've known for 50,000 years. The problem of big projects was solved eons ago. We built the pyramids. We sent guys to the moon. We won World War II. We know how to do big projects. The problem that we had was that we didn't know how to do the small thing that all big projects are made out of. We'd screwed that up. Right? We'd messed it up. From 1970 on, we had messed up the problem of doing something small. And by small, I mean something on the order of 50,000 lines of code. A team of 5 or 6 or 7 or 12 people doing a relatively small project. We had messed that up entirely. We had it right from the 1950s until the 1970s. And then we screwed it up. And we put this whole waterfall thing in. And that for 30 years, that screwed up the software industry. And then in the late 90s, we kind of looked around and said, man, did we mess this up? What were they doing back in the 50s? Oh, they were doing this thing. We should call it agile.
I like this version of history. Well, Bob, one other question, there's a question regarding agile that we get asked probably the most. Okay, so how do you implement the Agile Manifesto, or how do you become a more agile company, or how do you become a more agile team?
Well, the mechanical way you do that is by dividing your project up into nice short slices. 2 weeks, that's my favorite number. Actually, I'd prefer 1 week, but everybody seems to want to do 2 weeks. So, okay, 2 weeks, fine. Split your project up into a bunch of 2-week segments. You already know the deadline because the deadline is the first thing you know, right? So fine, start implementing, get some features, get some requirements, start implementing, measure how much you get done every 2 weeks, do the math, calculate when you're going to be done based on how much you're getting done every 2 weeks. Tell everybody, once you know, that you're not going to make the deadline early enough so that the managers can change the deadline or change something. And there's really not a lot more to it. I mean, that is agile in a nutshell. From the point of view of programming, if you're going to work this way, you need intense amounts of discipline to keep your code from destroying you. So test-driven development, refactoring, simple design, which you apply with intense discipline so that you don't lose control of this code that you are creating.
And so this is like the technical part, how you said. So when we're talking about Agile, lots of times we're talking about cultural change in the company. And when we're talking about values, that makes kind of sense to me. But how would you do that? So is there anything else besides the technical part to keep in mind?
So the cultural change is a much more interesting thing, much more interesting problem, and a much more difficult problem, of course. it is a problem that the military seems to have solved. The military, once you join the military, you are part of their culture. Now that does not seem to be the case in industry. In industry, the leaders of industry do not seem to push their culture down. That culture seems to bubble up from the bottom, or more accurately, culture actually bubbles up from the middle and down from the middle. It's the middle managers in companies that enforce the culture. That's what they were hired to do. Right? And when there is a cultural change that starts at the bottom, like Agile, they have this real big barrier to cross. The middle management barrier is put there in order to stop such cultural changes. So as cultural change comes up from the bottom, it hits the middle management layer, the middle managers kill it. They'll just push right back down on it and they'll kill it. So what we need to do is, it has to start from the bottom, because it's the programmers who drove this in the first place, right? They have to reach around to the top and get the CEOs and the CTOs and the COOs and all those guys on board. It's not hard to get them on board, because Agile is the way they run their companies, right? Good executives run their companies by dividing time up into a bunch of short sequences and then telling everybody to meet certain guidelines within those short sequences, and then they manage the uncertainty. That's how companies run. And once you sell the managers on that, once you sell the executives on that, and you can bypass the middle managers will all of a sudden now they will be Agile, because they're being told by the executives, oh yes, that's how we have to do it. And that makes it a little easier. That is a hard problem to solve. And most people fail at it. Most companies fail at this. And what we wind up with is something else. What happens in companies that attempt to go Agile and then fail is that some of the programmers get it. They change, their minds change. And then the company fails to go Agile. And now you've got two populations down below the middle managers. Those who want to be Agile and those who don't, and they cannot live together. They cannot coexist, right? Because their values are so different. And so one population or the other will leave. Now, maybe they stay in the same company and they leave to a different project. That's possible. Or maybe they leave the company and go to another company. In the United States, what we see is this migration from non-Agile companies to Agile companies, and the reverse. Agile companies lose their non-Agile people and put them over into non-Agile companies. And that sets up a very interesting competition between these companies that are Agile and non-Agile. And I know where I'm betting. I know where I'm putting my money.
I can guess where. That opens up for another question. So you're obviously like a hardcore software person, I understand. And many years of experience. I think you've always written many books on that topic. By the way, actually, before I go to my question, any of what's the book you would recommend to our newbies here? Your book they should choose to start.
Well, if you want to know about Agile, you could read Clean Agile.
Clean Agile. Camillo, could you please put the Amazon link to Clean Agile on the chat here so people could? Oh yeah, sure. Are you asking me to do that? No, Camillo, we have helping hand here. He's going to look that up and he's putting that in the chat. Here's another one. Clean architecture. You want to know how to build systems, with good clean architecture. You can read that book. Or if you want to know, how to do estimation and how to tell people, how to behave like a programmer, you could read the Clean Coder. Keep going, but I'm not going to. But that's great books, and I recommend everybody to take a look at those recommendations, because Bob Martin is very famous and well known for being an expert in that topic. So if you want to start, try that out. But I wanted to ask a question. So we've talked a lot about software here, and the Agile Manifesto, but obviously was born in a software environment, and software is becoming more and more important today. But we also see now Agile applied or used or talked about in other areas. We particularly, for example, clients in oil and gas, they use that with something that's absolutely not related to software. So what do you think about that? How do you see Agile outside of software?
Well, I have my doubts. Over the years, there have been two competing ways of running projects, right? The Agile way and the waterfall way. And both of these are valid, right? They're both valid techniques. If you have a project which has extremely well-defined requirements and has a very high cost of change, then you really want a waterfall model. There's no other economic solution. If you're building a skyscraper and you have to lay the foundation, changing that foundation later is really hard. So you kind of want to get that all laid out. On the other hand, if you have a project which has fuzzy requirements you're not sure about, and the cost of change is very low, Agile is perfect for that. That's what Agile is all about, trying to figure out what the requirements are, and the cost of change of software should be very low. As long as you follow those engineering disciplines and write your tests and refactor and do simple design, you can keep the cost of change very low. So when the cost of change is low and we have fuzzy requirements, definitely do Agile. If the cost of change is high and you've got well-defined requirements, definitely do waterfall. So I don't think that Agile needs to go everywhere.
Okay, that's I think a pretty good answer. I also happened to write a book, but just one. That was too much work for me. I don't think I'm doing another one.
It's hard work, isn't it?
I'm gonna get you a copy. I'm gonna get you a copy to thank you for being here. But that's actually exactly what we express there. So it's basically the uncertainty and the cost of change to take that into account. So I think I like that answer a lot. I'm glad so that works. So Bob, thanks a lot very much. We have only 2 minutes left. Maybe we could do one question from the participants, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
So let's see. We have lots of questions. So let me get you one. Whoa, that's a lot. Okay, here let's take this one. This is like a common one that I've also heard a couple of times. So this one is from Hermann Dieter. He say, hello and thank you for this webinar. My question is, how can we successfully deal with traditional oriented customers when your company is agile? So I guess to elaborate, I guess well, how I interpret it is like in agile we want also feedback, frequent feedback. So what happens if your customer wants don't want to give you feedback, only want to see the thing at the end, and there's a fixed scope, fixed price contract.
Imagine, I mean, this is very common, especially amongst contracting companies and consulting companies. Their customers want to know how much it's going to cost and when it's going to be delivered, and they want to know that upfront, and they don't want that to change. So the consulting companies do a big breakdown, and then they do an estimate and a quote and so on. How do you do that in an agile world? Now, it turns out that I have done this. Right? Long ago, I ran a consulting company, and we took on projects, and we did those projects in an agile way. And the way we offered what we offered our customers was this: we would deliver something to them every 2 weeks. Every iteration, we would deliver something to them. We would estimate that in points, the typical way you do it with Scrum or extreme programming. You estimate each feature with points, and then they would pay us based on the number of points delivered every 2 weeks. And then they could come back to us and say, well, we like this, we don't like that, and we could do the normal kind of feedback mechanism. And that way, they are sharing the risk with us. They pay for what they get. If we finish fast, they don't pay a lot. If they take a lot of time by changing everything, they pay a lot. It's a good share the risk model.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I think we are at the end of our time box, to use that term.